mouth is when I'm ocean waves.
Today on Virginia Legends podcast, I have sports agent Noah Croom, my old pal from UVA Law School. Noah is a St. Louis native who ran track at Stanford, went to UVA Law where I met him, practiced at Latham Watkins for a couple of years, like all great lawyers must do, I hear, from my friend Mike Egge. Worked in the counsel's office at the NBA, then was, I believe, the first assistant GM or in the first GM staff in the Vancouver Grizzlies expansion franchise. Then stayed there for a while, then became a sports agent, then came back and was the Timberwolves assistant GM, where he helped lead them to one of their best years in team history. He's back working with Mike Miller and as a sports agent again. Good to see you, Noah. Did I get most of that right?
You got most of that right. Good to see you as well.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I wanted to ask you is, we all love sports. Us dudes, we like you ran track. I played basketball. When you make a career in sports, does the novelty of working in sports ever wear out? Do you still love it, or and does it just become a job over time?
I still love it. I still love the competition. I still love, sort of being involved in something that's obviously very high profile and a lot of people care about. But in some ways, the things I enjoy most about my job are not necessarily the things that I think you might appear on its face.
Yeah. Well, what are some of those things that you like most?
I really enjoy the relationships I've made with a number of my clients. And so when I left the Grizzlies in 2000 and started my career as an agent, a number of the clients I had early on in my career, I still have very good relationships with. One of my first clients was a gentleman named Willie Green, who the 76ers drafted.
Yeah.
Worked with him for most of his career, and now he is the head coach of the New Orleans Pelicans, and still very close with him and his father and his family. A number of my former clients have jobs in the NBA. There's a point guard who played at Seton Hall, who named Andre Barrett, who played a little bit in the NBA, but went overseas and played for FC Barcelona. And he worked at the league office, and now he is working with G League Ignite. So I really value those relationships. And what's a little bit ironic is that I now have several clients who have offspring who are very good basketball players. And I was talking to one of them this morning, whose son is in Orlando at the NBA 100 camp, and he was the number 7 rated player in the most recent ESPN rankings for the class of 2025. So as I look back on my career, it's those relationships that I really value.
Well, I have a 19-year-old son who's at UVA, and one thing that we enjoy doing is watching old movies that I may have watched when I was his age. Mm-hmm. And the other day we watched Jerry Maguire, and he'd never seen it. And I was, first of all, shocked at how many lines in that movie that are almost like staples in our culture, like "You complete me" and "Show me the money." There's so many things about that movie I had forgotten about. But what about Tom Cruise as an agent? People who are too young to remember or ever watched that movie, he had that moment where he left his job and he wanted to get closer to his clients, like you're talking about right now, the relationship. And I guess he felt like it was becoming more of a cattle call. He wanted a more intimate relationship. And him and this one guy, they took each other back to the top. What about that movie resonates with you? And maybe those Jerry Maguire days are over, but does that movie resonate with you at all?
It does. It does. It was a great movie. And as an aside, when I lived in Vancouver for 20 years, and my oldest son became involved in acting and actually shot a pilot for Cameron Crowe.
Oh, sorry.
So I actually got to talk to him at one point, so that was pretty exciting. But no, great movie. I would say the agent business has changed a lot from when I entered it in 2000 and then sort of re-entered it 2 years ago. Certainly most recently, NIL has changed how early agents start recruiting players. I mean, we're developing relationships with players who are 15, 16 years old. You have a number of players who are reclassifying and leaving high school a year early and going to college. And so those were, and when I look at the 2024 draft, the 2023 draft was last week, many of the players you see on that list have relationships with agents already. And so if you're an agent and you are trying to recruit clients for a future draft, you're looking at the 25 and 26 draft to identify potential clients. And so, you're starting to develop relationships with kids that are much younger than they've been before. And because of NIL, some of these kids are making large sums of money, some even in high school. We've had some NIL deals done recently with kids who are still in high school for significant dollars. And certainly players in college are making significant dollars. And so that whole dynamic has changed. And, a lot of money is coming into the NBA. We're going to see some $300 million contracts shortly. And so it has changed dramatically from when I entered it in 2000.
Well, some of these kids can help us with our mortgages the way.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. So, you ran track at Stanford, and track is not a revenue sport. It's great prestige to be a track athlete, but you do it because you love it. You love to compete. Maybe, I don't know if you're on scholarship, but that can help sometimes. Do you see great opportunity with NIL with athletes like you were in college, or do you see NIL more of a case of the rich just getting richer earlier too?
Yeah, well, I don't know about the rich getting richer. First of all, I do think with the growth in revenues, particularly in revenue generating sports like football and basketball, I do think that the players deserve something. I think the problem is now the market is largely unregulated. I have found myself now, again, this is one of the changes brought by NIL, negotiating NIL deals on behalf of my clients. And so you may have a client who's testing the waters, or who you represent for NIL, and he transfers schools and he needs someone to help him navigate the negotiations with the collective, with the coaching staff, with whoever is doling out the money for the school or some alum. And most of these individuals don't have that experience or knowledge. So I have found myself involved in college conversations with college coaches much more than I ever have as we sort of negotiate various NIL deals. Happy to see some women getting compensated. I mean, there are some women who are making more by staying in college than they'll ever make as professional basketball players. So happy to see some of the money sprinkled amongst those athletes. But I think there needs to be some regulation and some sanity to the market. I mean, crazy. Every time I talked to college coaches in the spring, they were trolling the transfer portal to see which players were putting their names in and who might transfer to their school, and identifying players at certain positions. They were going to the NBA Combine because a number of the players who were testing waters there were returning to school. So it has brought many changes to the system, and not all of them have been good.
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe you have to be a lawyer to be an agent for NBA players, but with NIL, I believe it's the wild, wild west. Yeah, I hate that term, but do you think the states, or somehow maybe governing organizations of high school and college sports should have some kind of licensing process or some kind of regulation to make people understand some of the things some of the responsibilities that they have as an agent, and to educate people on what they're actually going to be doing when they represent athletes.
Yeah, I mean, most states do have a certification process already. Again, agents are required to be certified. I'm not sure how much those rules are enforced. Different states have different rules, which can be confusing. And if you are a resident of certain states, you can't enter into NIL deals, but you can if you're a resident of others, and you have, a number of players leaving their state and going to prep schools and establishing residency in another state. So I don't think it's something that needs to be done at the state level. I think there needs to be, and I hate to say this, some sort of federal intervention that brings some sanity to the marketplace. I also think one of the things, it's sort of NIL in concert with more lax transfer rules that I think has led to a lot of the problems, because players now can transfer the first time without sitting out. So you have players who are going to mid-majors or smaller schools, having great years and realizing they can make more money, or they can, play at a higher level, and going into the portal and transferring and getting paid, and it causes havoc with the system. You also have players who are putting their name in the portal as to get leverage with their current school and get more money from their current school. And so I think it's the combination of NIL and a more lax transfer system that has led to a lot of the issues.
And I think also a factor has been the COVID year, so that not only you have NIL, you have transfer portal, so you have 23-year-old men who are able to leverage their experience transfer, and it's denying, at least temporarily, opportunities to high school kids. I do a lot of local sports in Northern Virginia, and it was shocking, the dearth of opportunities, Division I opportunities for really good athletes in this area.
The number of scholarships given to high school players has definitely declined. Yes, part of it is COVID, players staying an additional year in college. Part of it is the system, but there are, and I've counseled several families as they struggled to find scholarships for their athletes. So it's become more challenging.
Yeah. With the NIL in place, does it? Do you think agents will have to make relationships earlier in that? They have to have the relationship with the athlete before it's made with someone else, and so by the time they're 22, 23, they already have a tight relationship with someone who may not have your incredible experience, but in and on the inside of teams, and also as a
yeah. I mean, what I've seen is a number of agencies running out and signing a number of players to NIL deals. What I will say is there's not a ton of money being paid to a lot of these athletes. I mean, if you have a relatively low number of social media followers and are not an active social media participant, most sponsors are not going to pay you a lot of money to drop a mention on your timeline. And so I think a lot of athletes and families have some misconceptions about NIL. The reality is most of the money is coming from the schools, collectives, alumni, and it's under the auspices of NIL that these collectives and other organizations have been formed. But that's where the vast majority of the money is coming from. For the top players, and if you're a projected lottery pick in the NBA draft, there may well be many opportunities out there for you to generate, mid to high six figures, or even $1 million for over $1 million for the players at the top of the draft. But for most college athletes, the money they receive is coming from the school.
As an athlete yourself, tell us a little bit about your own career. I know you're from St. Louis. Did you play other sports than just track? And how far did you get in track?
I ran track in high school, and I played football, and I played basketball with varying degrees of success. The school I attended had a relatively good football program, and we routinely competed in the state playoffs and championships. So probably had the most success in football, but had not really explored my track abilities until later in my high school career, and then ran at Stanford and competed in the Pac-12s and indoors and outdoors, but was not anything to write home about.
Yeah, was track a big part of your college experience?
I enjoyed it. Yeah, I met a lot of great people, and it was I think Stanford is a great place to explore those types of opportunities and get involved in different communities. So it was a great experience for me.
Yeah. Were you begin to think about being a sports agent even at that time?
Not really. I had always sort of had my sights set on law school. When I went to UVA, I did take a couple course. Alex Johnson
Yeah.
taught a sports law seminar, I believe, that I took. And the lawyers from Covington and Burlington came down
Yeah.
and
Applebaum or something like that.
yeah, I can't remember his name, but he went on to be general counsel at the NFL.
Yeah.
And so I was obviously very interested in sports, but did not, really look for jobs in sports necessarily. And then, I went to Latham and was a corporate lawyer, and was sort of doing that whole routine, interviewing for jobs at investment banks. And the recruiter who I was working with got the placement for the NBA. Gary Bettman was moving on to the NHL, and they were promoting a number of lawyers internally. So they were hiring a number of junior lawyers. And so went to the NBA and interviewed, and ended up getting the job, and it was a great opportunity. I mean, I sort of oversaw the salary cap in its infancy. Was involved in collective bargaining. Because I was a corporate lawyer, I worked on a lot of franchise transfers and ultimately expansion, which led me to getting the job in Vancouver and moving to Vancouver. But it was David Stern was the commissioner. So it was an exciting time to be involved in the NBA. It was a great experience working in the league office. As you can imagine, a lot of the people who worked there went on to other jobs in sports. So I think it is one of the reasons I have I'd say a relatively strong sports network. So it was great experience.
Well, I'll get back to the NBA in a second, but I have one Alex Johnson story I have to tell.
Okay.
So I was in class. He called on me once or twice. I guess I wasn't prepared. So I got a note in my mailbox to come see him at his office. So I went to see him, and I didn't know Alex, Professor Johnson, but he called me in and he said, Julian, you're disturbing our class. You're not prepared for class. It's disrupting our class. So I was like, well, stop calling on me. You call somebody else. But he kept calling on me. So to get back to the NBA, did you know my friend Tasha Williams at the NBA? I know she's still there, but was she there?
No, I don't think we overlapped. I was there a long time ago.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So was it a step back economically to take a job? Because that's one of those jobs where some folks, yeah.
I think particularly at the entry level, a lot of jobs in sports, because there are so many people who are interested in taking them, they don't pay what a comparable job in the private sector would pay, let's say. So, marginally, living in New York, but I would say, I felt like I was involved with a lot of exciting things. And I would say a lot of my law school classmates and friends who are lawyers were always very envious of the opportunity. So,
yeah. Well, when you went to the Grizzlies, it was an expansion franchise, and it's interesting because it's not a huge blueprint for expansion franchise, because it doesn't happen that often, and so my guess is you have to kind of make things up as you go along to some degree. What was that experience like in an expansion franchise as compared to the Timberwolves, a team that was, been around a while?
It was great. I mean, I would say not a blueprint for an expansion franchise in general, because although there had been, expansion a few years earlier, but the thing that I think really made it unique was expansion across an international border. And going into Canada, particularly Western Canada, where there was such a hockey tradition and not as much knowledge about basketball, a lot of our job was educating our fans about the sport. And so that made it a lot of fun. I mean, it was really a startup. Developed a lot of close relationships with the people who were there at the beginning, who I worked with, who I'm still friends with. And it was very different. When you go to an established team, a lot of people work in the NBA for many, many years. So there's a contingent of people at these teams who've been there for 15 or 20 years. And oftentimes the operation staff comes in and is new. So that was one of the most distinct differences. And I mean, in the Timberwolves experience was great. But it was really exciting to be part of a new team in a new environment. There were tons of issues too that came up that no one could have anticipated, exchange rate fluctuations that impacted us negatively. The dollar took a huge dive, probably third year that we were in Vancouver. and keeping in mind most of our sponsorship and ticket revenue and broadcast revenue was in Canadian dollars, but our largest expense, player salaries, was in US dollars. So that hit the team quite hard. It was a relatively small market because, the ocean is to the west. The territory of the team, which is a 50-mile radius around the arena, was not as large as it was for most teams. And the population in British Columbia is not as concentrated once you get outside of Vancouver. So there were some challenges as far as that was concerned, but it was a great experience, and loved BC. Ended up living there for 20 years.
Is it hard to build culture in Canada, especially Western Canada? Sports teams, it's all about culture in terms of fans that come every single day, fans that support the team on network TV and the radio. Is it hard to do that?
I would say the hard part was that for most players, when they were drafted there, and we had the Steve Francis fiasco and other issues. I think for many of the players, it felt like they were in a foreign country, and really, 75% of the population of Canada lives within 50 miles of the U.S. border. I would contend that it's really not that different, but at the time, couldn't get ESPN on television. Obviously, the money was different. There were certain items because every food item had to be labeled in English and French. There were certain items that you could not purchase in Canada that you could get in the US. We're close enough to the border, however, you could go across the border and get whatever you want. But I think some of the players struggled with those differences initially. I think towards the end, players loved Vancouver, and I think to a man, visiting teams loved coming to Vancouver. It was multicultural. There was great dining options. It was a beautiful city. The climate was great. So that, in addition to educating our fans, we had to educate our players as well. The tax rate in Canada is higher and rivals most high tax jurisdictions in the US, like New York City or California. So, I had to go to Ottawa on one occasion and lobby the government to get them to make a change in the tax code that would help our players and save them on some tax. So a lot of unique issues that did not exist with any other team other than the Raptors, I suspect. But that made the job, I think, more interesting than it might have otherwise been. A ton of immigration issues and issues getting players into the country, as you might imagine, and players, family, friends that I didn't envision working on, but were a good experience and fun for me at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, the Economist just rated Vancouver, I think, the second or third most livable city in the world. What makes it so wonderful?
People are great. Weather's great. Great recreational options. As I said, very international. And while, relatively close to Seattle, completely different feel. As I said, I think most of our players came to love it. I know a number of, people all over the league would tell me how disappointed they were when Vancouver moved to Memphis, that was one of the worst trades in NBA history, Vancouver for Memphis. And a number of people who worked for the team when I was there that went to Memphis, I think would agree with that.
Yeah.
No offense to Memphis.
Exactly. So you mentioned earlier as an agent, you love getting close to the players and building those relationships. I remember in the movie Moneyball, the assistant GM in that movie, he was told, Billy Beane was told he doesn't want to get near the athletes. It was different. He wanted to keep that distance in case he ever had to fire them. As an assistant GM at Vancouver and then later at Minnesota, did you build relationships with players?
Yeah, for me, that was important. Quite frankly, for me, in some respects, trading a player or waiving him when I had a relationship made it easier because, hopefully they understood. And I think for the most part they did, or even in contract negotiations that, I genuinely cared about them as individuals and their families, and that whatever decisions were made were not personal, but really, part of my job running the franchise. I'm sure some of them understood that and others didn't. But yeah, I would say that I took a very different approach. I mean, I still have very good relationships with a number of the players that were here in Minnesota, some of whom we had to let go or some of whom were traded. So um, that was much more my style than not having a relationship with them or not communicating.
Have you ever represented a player that you had first come in contact with because you were in administration, you were assistant GM?
I have, well, so when I left the Grizzlies, I went to work for an agent named Aaron Goodwin. And Aaron had just signed LeBron James. And during my tenure in Vancouver, he had represented Sharif Abdur-Rahim. He had an office in Seattle, so I worked out of the Seattle office. And in Seattle, he had Vin Baker and Gary Payton. And so um, there were a few players. Jamal Crawford was a client of ours, and we actually signed him in Minnesota when I was with the Timberwolves. So yeah, there was some crossover.
Yeah. Did you learn things from being on the inside that help you in representation?
Yeah, I mean, and I think I'm better now than I was when I left the Grizzlies. I think I have a better understanding of the system and how things work, and maybe a little bit more nimble and able to anticipate changes. We have a new CBA that's going to go into effect basically on Saturday. And I think my understanding of the rules and how that will impact my clients has given me a much better understanding of really all parts of being an agent.
Well, you talked earlier about contract negotiation. Um, Obviously, you get a joy at getting your client a big contract and
Mhm.
making them money, and I'm sure most likely you more money. Is there any joy in representing the other side when you're on the team and you're trying to sometimes encumber the player longer? Sometimes, work he's older and maybe
Yeah,
a
I
little.
guess I guess I don't look at it that way. I mean, um, there were a number of players who we gave contracts to that, I mean, they're generational wealth, that they will be wealthy for, and their kids will be wealthy. So, I mean, I felt that we were really doing them a service, and particularly for, African American men and their families and their communities, and their ability not only to help their families but to go back to their communities and for their communities to benefit. I mean, um, I thought we were helping them in many respects and putting them in a position of power. So I did not look at it as taking advantage of someone or somehow, um, um, you know, exercising power or control over them. I felt like, in most instances, at least, we were extremely generous, and some of the numbers are, and then they continue to rise. And as I said, many of these people will be their kids will be wealthy as a result of the money they made in the NBA.
Generally, how have you built your relationships that ended up being a representation? There's so many agents out there, and I know you've got a great track record. But how do you get started with a player that you may not know that well?
Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky. I think because I've been in basketball for such a long time, and even when I went to the team side, I have a plethora of college coaches and AAU coaches who I have relationships with. Um, People call me up and ask me if I'm interested in representing their client. From clients, a lot of the people in basketball are sort of lifers and continue in basketball. So there are AAU coaches who directed players to me 15 years ago who are still directing players to me now that I'm back in the business. There are um, people who were involved in AAU programs that may have had um, players back then that are still involved in basketball. They call me, and as I said, and maybe I shouldn't be as surprised, but so many people who I recruited or had relationships with 20 years ago who have kids who are now very good basketball players. So, and their parents and the dads are still involved. So, um, everybody says basketball is a small community, and I believe it is. And I think once you've been in it for a long time, these relationships are natural.
Yeah. Well, I used to go to a health club with Calvin Hill, Grant Hill's father,
Sure.
and you probably know Grant and Calvin. And one thing Calvin had talked about, former running back for the Cowboys and the Redskins and others, Browns. He really didn't want Grant to get in a relationship where the agent got a percentage. I remember this. We talked about it, and he wanted the lawyer to work like it was me and my buddy Gerald Purnell. We used to all talk, and he wanted Grant's agents to work hourly, like Gerald and I were working in those days. Um, is that a thing now? Do agents get paid any differently? I know at some point it was 6% or there was a percentage.
So right now, the Players Association limits uh, agent fees to 4% of their playing contract if they receive more than the minimum and 2% of the minimum. And there's another formula for determining fees for rookie scale deals, but most agents don't charge on those deals. There's an agent from DC who you may know, Jim Tanner, who for a long time charged on an hourly basis, and he was a lawyer. Worked at Williams and Connolly, and left there and sort of continued that practice. But I believe even he now charges a percentage. I mean, I've seen some players who have dictated that they'll only pay their agent a certain fee. Others who have limited the percentage. So there's a lot of different permutations, but the hourly billing has not really taken hold in the sports agent business in any sport, quite frankly, that I'm aware of.
You mentioned other sports, and I think you've been involved in companies that are involved in different sports. But do you get a sense that being an agent in basketball in the NBA is much different than football or hockey or baseball?
I mean, I think there are nuances to each sport.
Mhm.
And whether it be where the players come from, their backgrounds. I mean, I think football players are different than basketball players, are different than hockey players, are different than baseball players. But I think in many respects, the job is about earning your client's trust and making sure that he understands that you're putting his interest ahead of your own or anyone else's and doing the best for him that you can. So I think the job is very much the same, but when it comes to recruiting players or developing relationships with players, or quite frankly, where you find players, I think it's all very different.
Yeah. Well, one of your greatest players that you had, at least in talent, I guess we can all agree that kind of unfulfilled potential, unfortunately, was Delonte West from Eleanor Roosevelt.
Mhm.
I forgot where West went to college. Where did you go to college?
Joe's.
Oh, that's right, St. John's. Tell us a little bit about your journey with Delonte. It's kind of a sad story, and because he had so much potential.
A lot of potential, great person, good heart. Um, I had not dealt a lot with mental illness prior to becoming an agent, and I mean, I think a lot of people haven't. So it was new to me, but he was diagnosed early in his career as being bipolar. Um, and I mean, when someone described to me what that was, the wild mood strings, he'd call me up and start yelling at me and calling me all sorts of names. Sometimes he could be incredibly kind and thoughtful, um, but I mean, he was troubled, and this was the typical case of getting calls at all hours of the night. Um, Started very early on when he was drafted by the Boston Celtics. I'm sure people in DC remember when he was pulled over, I believe in Maryland, driving down the highway on a three-wheel motorcycle with a shotgun and a guitar case on his back.
That's right. Yeah.
And his family still lives in the DC area. And he lives with his mother there, but is still struggling, I think, to deal with his mental illness. And so it's hard, but I mean, we're still in contact. I still talk to his mother, but he was very talented. I see a lot of these same characteristics in a number of athletes, and so I don't think it's all that uncommon now that I've had a chance to experience it and sort of know some of the markers. But he, basically spent the vast majority of his money on lawyers, and it was, yeah, it's a sad story, but I'm not sure there's much anyone can do.
Yeah. Well, how about some happier stories? Like, what are some of the athletes you've been able to help, and you really feel like you got good results for them, and they also had good careers?
Well, I mean, I mean, I've mentioned some of them earlier. I think the most fulfilling part of it is, and I've had a number of clients who played in the NBA, number of clients who've been overseas, but that, um, I still feel that I am, well, maybe not their agent, sort of a unofficial advisor or a mentor. A client who recently returned from overseas and who is sort of trying to figure out what he does next, reached out to me a few weeks ago, and we had a long chat about sort of different options. We're going to get together this season. He's coming to Minnesota with his family this summer. We're going to get together. So, um, it is instances like that that I think give me comfort that I've sort of had an impact on their lives and that they trust me and respect my opinion and my guidance. And so that's, in many respects, why I do this.
Yeah. No, I'm blanking on the name of your current company again.
Lift sports
Yeah,
management.
yeah. So I read your website, and Miller, great story, very inspirational website. I mean, I guess we all talk about we have a different approach, but it really seems like you guys have a good way about you at Lyft.
Yeah. So about 2 years ago, I was approached by Mike Miller. He was starting a new agency. Um, and, I was uncertain as to whether or not I wanted to re-enter the agent business. And we spoke for several months, quite frankly. Um, and then he was coming to Minnesota because he was recruiting a player who was from here. So he made several trips here, and I got to know him a little bit, and decided to come on board about 2 years ago, and it's been great. He obviously had a long NBA career, played in the NBA for 18 years, Rookie of the Year. Um, and after he finished playing, he lives in Memphis. He was an assistant coach for Penny Hardaway at the University of Memphis, so had a lot of relationships with young players, some who had just entered the NBA, some who would be entering. So has been a great resource as far as that's concerned. Does a great job of connecting with players and their families. So I think we represented Paulo Banchero last year, who was the first pick in the draft and the Rookie of the Year. So far so good. It's a challenging business, obviously, with lots of ups and downs, but I feel like we're heading in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, no, you've had one of the most amazing careers, at least to a sports nut like me. You did some incredible things since law school, kept yourself in the news. What are some of your other passions in life? Yeah, you can share with us what you want, family or whatever. But what are
Yeah,
some other ways you've kept busy all these years?
I mean, I think my family is probably the primary one. I've got a 16-year-old son, a 15-year-old son, and a 9-year-old daughter. And so, as you can imagine, most weekends are, if I'm in town, are spent driving them around to their various activities and spending time with them. So between my job and my family, my time is pretty full. I'm still a sports fan. I still follow the St. Louis Cardinals, and when I get back to St. Louis, try to get to as many games as I can.
Mhm.
Uh, and that's I'm involved in a number of sort of charitable and civic organizations here in Minnesota. When I came here with the Timberwolves, I got involved in the community in a number of ways, and have found that to be particularly as rewarding as well.
Yeah. Well, and my last question, though, I really appreciate your time. How do you advise young lawyers or young wannabe agents about getting into the business, and what's the best way, and whether or not you think it's even worth it?
Now that is an excellent question. Um, most young lawyers who reach out to me, I advise them, if they are just completing law school, to practice law. I think that there's a lot to be gained from a legal job, whether it be in a firm or otherwise. Um, the agent business can be challenging, and if you are going to be an agent, you need to have access to talent. I think it is very hard to come from a place where you don't have relationships with young athletes or coaches or someone in sports. Maybe you played the sport at a relatively high level and have those relationships, because it's all about access to players. And so You know, a lot of people want jobs working at our firm or reach out asking if they can get hired. And it's not hard to find people who you can hire to do work, but you know, if you want to be rewarded for your work and to be an agent, you've got to be able to bring players to the table. So if there's someone out there who's thinking about being a sports agent, I would say start developing those relationships early in your career. If you're playing AAU basketball when you're in high school, make sure you stay in touch with your AAU program, or you know, if you're in school, develop relationships with some of the players on the team, because having access to talent is the most important part of being a sports agent.
All about relationships. Back to that, right? So
It is.
yeah. So well, look, no, this has been great. Good to see you, man. We I hope.
Good to see you as well. Thank you for reaching out.
Yeah, maybe next time. I don't know. You come to DC, but I'd love to see you. I haven't been to the land of Prince in many years, if ever. But if you ever in DC, let's get together, get coffee, get dinner or something.
That sounds great. My client who's with the Wizards was traded a few weeks ago, but hopefully I'll be back there soon.
Yeah, that'll be great. Okay, no, well, look, this has been great.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, let's do a better job keeping in touch.
All right, take care.
Okay. All right, buddy.
Bye.
Thanks.